Once again, welcome to our event, Ukraine and Syria, Resistance to Putin's Armies of Destruction. I'm Stanley Heller, Administrator of Promoting Enduring Peace, a peace and environmental organization founded in 1952. We'll hear from just two speakers, so we'll give them both adequate time to get into a lot of details about the present situation. And afterwards, we'll have Q&A. We hope to get into many of the hot button issues, no-fly zones, reparations, proxy wars, sanctions, diplomacy, pacifism, etc. We're going to start with about 1 minute of video from protests where supporters of justice for Ukrainians and Syrians took part, sometimes together. Okay, our first speaker will be Alex Kuzma. He's the Chief Development Officer for the Ukrainian Catholic University Foundation. He's a lawyer and he served as Development Director for the Children of Chernobyl Relief Fund. And remember, the Chernobyl nuclear reactor accident started April 26 of 1986. Alex was a longtime activist with Promoting Enduring Peace in the 1990s, traveled on an ecological tour down the Dnipro River from Kiev to Odessa. He's often a spokesperson for the Connecticut Ukrainian American community. Alex.
Thanks very much, Stanley. It's great to be with you all. And thank you for this opportunity just to share some of the perspectives from the Ukrainian community. There's a pretty unified consensus as to the feelings toward this war. Stanley, if you can load up those that short PowerPoint, I'd be grateful just to give folks a little bit of background, if I may. Yeah, just to let you know, this is the university that I work with is in Western Ukraine. It's in Lviv, near the Polish border. So that what we've seen is that our university's become a virtual refugee center now for a lot of the folks fleeing from the fighting in Mariupol and Kharkiv and even Kyiv. Thank you. And yeah, just the next one. I'll go to the next slide there. This was actually I often go back to this photo and it haunts me in many ways because this was a rally that happened in Mariupol back in 2014 during the first attack by Russian troops on eastern Ukraine after they had annexed Crimea. Putin's assumption then was that all the Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine were going to rally to him, and he actually found out. He actually didn't learn his lesson the first time around because there was vast opposition to any kind of invasion at that time, and this was a scene from this mass rally that they had in Mariupol. I'm often haunted by this image because I think, how many of these people are still alive, how many of these people are in underground shelters, how many of them have been deported to Russia, going through the filtration camps that Putin has established. And as you could see from the little image on the left-hand side, I mean, they were already thinking of Putin as a Hitlerian fascist character. And I remember one of the articles that came out at that time was that even elderly ladies, the babushki, the grandmothers, were laying anti-tank mines, not mines, but anti-tank barriers to protect the city. So just the next slide. Thank you, Stanley. We're really at a very painful inflection point in Ukraine right now, because we're already seeing a lot of the elements of genocide, the bombing of civilian populations, especially in Kharkiv and Mariupol, which are two of the most Russian-speaking cities. So to the degree that Putin was using that as a pretext to invade, it's kind of absurd, because he's actually reserved his most ruthless attacks for those cities. So it kind of harkens back to the Vietnam era, where people used to say we had to destroy the village in order to save it. And this is kind of Putin's mentality right now, that he has to destroy these cities that have basically defied him. And so in many ways, Mariupol reminds me of the terrible tragedy of Aleppo and Guernica and other cities that were devastated by fascist attacks. So they're leveling a lot of these cities to rubble. We've all seen the coverage from Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, where there have been mass murders already documented. And the mayor, Boychenko, the mayor of Mariupol, had said that he's based on his evidence and statistics, it could be as many as 20,000 people have already been killed. And that's just over a 2-month period. So it's really a ghastly loss of life when we think about it. And also, there have been growing reports about mass rape and torture, mothers and fathers being forced to watch their daughters being raped in public, which is, you can imagine, just a devastating trauma for anybody to live through. I did receive some very moving information today that there's a group of psychiatrists from the Yale Child Studies Center that are planning to go to Ukraine to actually meet with some of the children that were traumatized and raped during this time. So there will be a direct Connecticut connection with some of these individuals. But the other really terrifying thing is that there's this attempt at forced deportation of civilians and children to Russia, that basically they all need to be reindoctrinated. They're all, children as young as 5 years old are crazy Nazis. And so they need to be, deprogrammed from their Ukrainian patriotism. And so there's already been pretty serious reports of children being put on trains and sent all the way to Vladivostok, where they're going to, they're forced to attend schools where they're learning Russian and trying to be disabused of their Ukrainian roots. So, and on top of that, you have this constant drumbeat from Putin and from his major propagandists, basically, Dugin and Solovyov and many of his, Margarita, Simonyan, the folks that are kind of the main mouthpieces for Putin, are constantly demonizing Ukrainians as being some kind of horrific people. And this is a country that, for 30 years had made peace with all of its neighbors, had eliminated its nuclear arsenal. So it should be the darling of the international peace community, because this was the third or fourth largest nuclear power in the world, had it kept all of its nuclear weapons, and it decided to disband the entire nuclear arsenal in the interests of world peace. And on top of that, they've maintained peaceful relations with their former enemies, Poland, Turkey, the Crimean Tatars. So this notion that somehow Ukraine was provoking, and actually Ukraine was even the largest trading partner for Russia, so that even in terms of Russia's national interests, it doesn't make sense that this war would be launched. Next slide, and I'll just go through these quickly, because I want to make sure that Nidal I don't want to shortchange my colleague here on the next thing. And so, we really are, even though at the very early stages of this war, we're already deeply concerned about the potential for a genocide, partly because of the statements that have come out of the Kremlin that they're basically planning to somehow, destroy the whole country if they're allowed to do it. And so Ukrainians are not strangers to genocide. Actually, the gentleman who originated the term genocide was Raphael Lemkin, who's a Jewish Ukrainian lawyer from Lviv, the city where our university is based. And back in the 40s, he originated this term, and he said one of the first classic cases of genocide was the Ukrainian famine, the Holodomor, which was Stalin's attempt to crush resistance from the Ukrainian countryside. And so he confiscated all of the foodstuffs from a vast area in eastern and southern Ukraine, all the way down to Odessa province and all the way up to Sumy and Chernihiv. My father-in-law actually was one of the children that was sent to Odessa. He was living in Poltava and would have probably starved to death, but he was shipped out by his astute parents to save his life. But this was a horrific famine. And this is one reason why the Ukrainians are fighting so tenaciously against Russia, because they have every expectation that should Russia dominate Ukraine, that there would be a repetition of this kind of carnage. And then we know the Armenian genocide, the Cambodian genocide, the Rwandan, the Syrian civil war also. I'm not even sure if these are accurate figures now. In Syria, they're probably up to 400,000, but these are monstrous death tolls that really need to be considered. So just the next slide, if I may. The most chilling thing that just came out recently was on April 3rd, RIA Novosti, which is one of the official government news bureaus, issued a statement that was really devastating in the sense that they basically said that they're prepared to kill, if necessary, a majority of Ukrainians that remain in the country. So you're looking at, out of a country of 42 million people, their intent seems to be to kill as many as 20 to 22 to 24 million Ukrainians, if need be, by their agenda. And the rest that they plan to put into Cambodian Khmer Rouge type of resettlement camps or reindoctrination camps. So we can expect that there would be, massive abuse there, and, torture and abuse and additional executions. And then also, besides the labor camps, they're planning to send children to Russia in large numbers. And basically the name Ukraine, they claim, needs to disappear. It's an unreal thing, even though there's 35 million people in Ukraine that speak Ukrainian, and another 5 million that speak it outside the country. And this is a country that's had a very rich culture lasting over 1,000 years. The agenda that's been now stated is that this country has no right to exist, and this culture and this people have no right to exist as who they are, according to their own identity. So the next slide. And Snyder also commented in his commentary on this. He said basically that this is the first time that he's seen as a student of mass murder and genocide in the world. He's the author of Bloodlands and a number of other the Red Prince and other important studies of Eastern Europe. He said this is the first time that while a genocide is beginning to unfold, that the perpetrator of the genocide is actually declaring the intent to commit a genocide. And intent is very important in terms of Raphael Lemkin's definition of what that mass murder with the intent of destroying in whole or in part an ethnic or religious or national group is the essence of what genocide is all about. So I did want to just briefly touch on this point because Putin has been saying that all the Ukrainians are Nazis, and that this is a fascist coup that toppled Yanukovych back in 2014, et cetera. But this was just a pretty graphic comparison that was done by Trudy Rubin, who's a columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Trudy's traveled to Ukraine a number of times, and just out of curiosity, she said, let's compare. We know that Putin's been sending vast amounts of money to many right-wing parties and fascist and neo-Nazi groups in Europe, especially France, with Marine Le Pen, who got $25 million loan that doesn't have to be repaid to propel her campaign back in 2017. Trudy Rubin looked at this and said, look, in France, 25% of the population back in 2014 voted for Le Pen. Austria, 20%. Denmark, the country that is famous for its defense of its Jewish population against the Nazis. Even there, the Dansk Folkeparti, which is a neo-Nazi party, gained 27%. Hungary, and these are outdated figures now because Hungary now has a majority, Viktor Orban's party, and Greece also, the Golden Dawn, up to 10%. Even in 2014, right on the heels of that revolution, there was only a combined 2.3% of the electorate voted for a far-right party, a combination of Svoboda and Pravi Sector. So next slide, and just a quick update on this. So, Marine Le Pen got 41% of the vote, so it's gotten even worse. And in Hungary, Orban got 54%. Even Sweden, which is, has a reputation as a very liberal country, Jimmy Atkinson's party, which started out as a neo-Nazi party, has 17%. And in contrast to this, Svoboda and Pravi Sector, again, actually received less votes the last time, at 1%, while Volodymyr Zelensky, who's a man of Jewish heritage, got elected by 73% in a country that has only 1% or 2% Jewish population. So the question is, where are all these Nazis that Putin keeps talking about? Next slide. And I'm going to wrap up in just a second. But one reason why I think there is a different ethos and a different attitude toward inter-ethnic harmony in Ukraine, which has really been lost on a lot of the international community, is that for Ukrainians, their founding father was this guy, Taras Shevchenko, who was a poet. He was actually a serf. He was emancipated by a Russian aristocrat who recognized his talent as an artist and a painter. He actually ended up living in a fairly comfortable environment in St. Petersburg, and was kind of the life of the party for many of the bourgeois parties that were happening. But Shevchenko wrote very passionate poetry in opposition to the Tsar and denouncing serfdom in Ukraine. He was actually friends with American Black abolitionists like Ira Aldridge, who was an actor who fled the United States before the Civil War and ended up in Ukraine. And he was an abolitionist himself. He actually was exiled. He was convicted of crimes against the state because he wrote against the Tsar and insulted the Tsar's wife, I guess, and that was unforgivable. So they sent this guy out to Kazakhstan for 25 years, and he served as an indentured servant there. And even there, he fostered the idea of liberation struggles between various nations. So he was one of the first white people or Caucasian Europeans that advocated for the rights of the Kazakh people. And there's actually a couple of cities named for Shevchenko because he's kind of a folk hero in Kazakhstan. And Shevchenko's whole ethos was that he said, for my fellow Ukrainians, I want them to learn what is foreign to them, what is unfamiliar, but never to forsake their own. And so the idea was there's nothing wrong with learning about different cultures or borrowing from other cultures or appreciating the richness of other nations' literatures or art or music, but we should not forsake what is our own. And that is really infused the spirit of this Ukrainian revolution that's really gone on since the 1960s. When you look at how Ukraine forged its freedom, it was through a series of nonviolent revolutions, which I think would have been the envy of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and certainly Lech Walesa. I mean, they started out with a purely nonviolent struggle in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s with the dissident movement, which basically had poets and writers being sent off to the Gulag because they wrote articles and books denouncing Russian ethnic policies that crushed the cultures of the other republics. Then, you had the post-Chernobyl uprising with the Green World Party, where basically moms in Ukraine denounced the government for failing to protect their kids from massive irradiation from Chernobyl. And then the independence movement, Ruch, again, purely nonviolent. And then another nonviolent revolution in 2004, the Orange Revolution, which scared the bejesus out of Putin because he hates colored revolutions, as he calls them, and then the Revolution of Dignity in 2013, 2014. So this is a country that's bent over backwards to maintain nonviolence until the war broke out in 2014, at which point all bets were off. So just the next slide, and then just two more slides, and I'm all done. One of the things that is not widely known, has not been covered by either academics or others, is that since gaining its independence, Ukraine has maintained a very strong program, even to the point of having a national curriculum on interethnic harmony and understanding and solidarity between various ethnic groups. Excuse me. So this is just one example. There's programs all over the country that bring kids together from Jewish, Ukrainian, Polish, and Crimean Tatar backgrounds for summer seminars where each of the communities shares its own national traumas, what kind of oppression, genocide, or deportations they experience, so they can appreciate each other's suffering and also, respect their own unique culture. And this was a program that happened in the city of Dnipro. Behind these students, you can see the dams on the Dnieper River. And and I learned just after the war broke out, actually, from my friend Yana Rathman, who works with a group called Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, that apparently there's a national curriculum about the Holocaust that was taught in every school in Ukraine, featuring not only the history of the Holocaust itself, but also history of collaboration, history of the people that rescued Jews from the Holocaust, and also the post-war period, how Ukrainians and Jews and Tatars and other minorities were able to forge partnerships in defiance of Russification and colonial policies on the part of Russia. And just the last piece. So this is just one of the iconic images of the huge rally that happened in 2014 on the Maidan, the Independence Square in downtown Kyiv, where over 1 million people stood out in the freezing cold for weeks and weeks on end. A lot of the students from our university were out there, and actually one of our professors got gunned down on the last day of the uprising. A guy named Bogdan Solchanik, who was killed by government snipers that last day. But this is how passionately these people feel about wanting to join the rest of the European community and defying oppression and tyranny. And yet this is the population that Putin basically says you have no right to your independence, you have no right to your autonomy, you have no right to your life. And even though Ukrainians in 1991 voted by 92% of the electorate for their independence, that's a non-starter. This is a country that has no right to exist, according to Putin. So that's just a quick background on why Ukrainians are so passionately resisting this onslaught from Putin.
Thank you so much. And we'll discuss that in the Q&A. I would mention, though, Timothy Snyder gave the Schaefer lecture a couple of years ago for promoting enduring peace.
Mm-hmm.
Our next speaker is Nidal Betare. He's a Palestinian refugee who was born in Damascus and raised in Yarmouk camp. He lived there until December 2011. He is now based in Washington, D.C., where he works as a senior programs manager at People Demand Change. He's written several important articles on the Syrian uprising and its cruel repression. Nidal Betare.
Thank you, Stanley, and thank you, Alex. And actually, I would like to start from almost where Alex closed his presentation. And thank you for this information, Alex. Especially when Alex was talking about the Orange Revolution and the revolution and of dignity. I would like to say that the colored revolutions, as it was called, it inspired our generation in Syria. I was born in 1979. It was still during the Soviet Union era, and in 2000, when the regime, or when Bashar al-Assad came to power, things like we were promised a lot of to be given a lot of freedom and to open the civil society and etc. And then the colored revolution in Eastern Europe started, and it impacted our generation. We were in our 20s back then, to an extent that I still remember how many people, how many of my friends were taken by the security service from the university, and were jailed actually from 2005, 2006 until 2011, when the Syrian revolution erupted. And one of the stories that I will never ever forget, that it's really known that the revolutions in Eastern Europe back in the beginning 2000s inspired basically and mainly the democratic revolution or the Arab revolution, as it's called in Lebanon. And I still remember I was sitting with one of my friends in the university, and we were discussing the revolution and the protest in Lebanon. And next day he did not come to the university. He was taken by the security service or the secret service. And this, I think, maybe this is one of the main nostalgic memories for me and for many of my peers about Ukraine. And maybe there is, on the other hand, I know that Ukraine was one of the most, one of the two essential states in the Soviet Union, but also in Syria, we also have our share from the Soviet Union as well. Syria was part of the socialist camp or the socialist world starting from 1960s until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I have to say that we have lived through the 1948 George Orwell's novel, the structure of the Syrian state was structured and planned in Moscow and in Eastern Germany back then. The security services, all of them, were trained by the Soviet Union and Eastern Germany. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we went through the same suffering and the same struggle to get rid of this dictatorship and authoritarianism that was that was the result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Fast forward to the Syrian revolution. Between 2011 and 2015, the Russians were not that engaged in Syria that much. I have also to say that until today, some security branches in Syria, the heads or the leaders of these security branches, they get hired in Moscow before and approved before they sit on their chairs in Damascus. So Russians were never ever away from Syria. And there is a say that people used, especially who served in the army, they used to say, because in the Syrian army, it's a Russian army actually, and there were a lot of experts who come to Syria and teach and train the Syrian officers. Syrian officers, a lot of them, they learn, or they are being taught until today the Russian language as a second language in the Syrian army. So they were taught, one of the things they were taught by Russians, that in Russia we say, this is what they say, in Russia we say, if you want to control the Middle East, you have to put your keys in Damascus. And this is like one of the theories that was embedded in the Syrian army ideology and beliefs. However, fast forward to 2015, the Russians came to Syria militarily and started their engagement military in Syria. I have to say that the playbook that is being used today in Ukraine, it's literally the same thing that had been done in Syria. Aleppo, invading southern Syria, trying to play. I will give you this approach, like an approach. Maybe it's different than Ukraine, but it shows you the approach of the way that Russians think. Russians came to Ukraine and they were they have all these theories about the Russian-speaking people in certain areas. In Syria, they have been bringing people from Muslim people from Russia, from Chechnya, and sending them, and Sunni, by the way, sending them to Sunni areas and telling them that we are here to protect you. We are Sunni like you. they have like this. They have these skills that try to approach societies, but also they are really brutal and barbaric. Um, I still remember going to the UN and visiting the what's called the convoy for Syria at the UN. I don't remember his name now. Demistoro, I think was, and we were talking about trying to negotiate or to tell the Russians just to give humanitarian corridors for Syrians in Aleppo just to leave. And unfortunately, at the time, we figured out like maybe Aleppo that was where we discovered how broken the international community is, and how weak the international community is, because they completely destroyed the whole city. Even the historic city that was built thousands of years ago was destroyed, and they did not want any people to get alive out of that city. And this is one of the theories of Russians, that they connect with an authoritarian regimes like Bashar al-Assad in Syria. To an extent, in one of Bashar al-Assad's speeches, he said, like, it's okay that a lot of refugees are outside of Syria. It's okay that a lot of IDPs are outside of Syria. It's okay that a lot of people were killed. Now we have a homogeneous community. And this is the way that Russians think as well. And I am not surprised at all by what Alex said and mentioned, and what Russians actually said over and over again, that they don't have any problem by killing half of Ukraine, or maybe all of Ukrainians. I'm just trying to give an approach about like why Ukraine and Syria are kind of alike. Syrians really started this revolution peacefully for freedom, and Ukrainians did the same back in 2004. And Ukrainians inspired the whole world, but back in 2004, including us in Syria and the Arab world, that inspired the whole Arab Spring as well. And this is a fact that is not being said yet, and not being spoken about widely yet. But I think there will be a time that we will talk a lot about how the colored revolutions inspired us in the Arab world. And unfortunately, that it's really unfortunate, like to say that also the massacres in Bucha, in my neighborhood in the Yarmouk camp, are just the same. My house was destroyed by a Russian airjet, and actually. And it is unfortunate to say that the more Ukrainians will liberate in Ukraine, the more they will reveal and discover that Russians did really ugly massacres against Ukrainians. I'll stop here and maybe we can discuss more during the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Change the view to gallery for a while. So let's think about questions that you might want to ask either of our panelists. Maybe we could start off with this question of no-fly zone that bothers a lot of people. Some are for it, some against. What would you say about that, Alex?
I mean, President Zelensky's been really pleading for a no-fly zone, and I think there are different aspects of a no-fly zone. One is a declaration that basically says that certain areas are going to be off limits to any aircraft. And the premise for a no-fly zone, as I understand it, is to create a humanitarian corridor to basically say, for 5 days or 6 days, we're going to extract all the people from Mariupol or Aleppo, to bring them into a safe zone. So you're at least saving, hopefully several thousand lives in the process. There's always the risk of, if Putin feels offended by the imposition of a no-fly zone, he could certainly send planes out, and there could be a direct confrontation between, NATO Air Force units and Russian units. I think, in all honesty, I think Ukrainians feel strongly, and Ukrainian Americans tend to feel also, that is not an they don't think that's an unreasonable risk, because NATO air power is much stronger than Russian. I mean, the Russian Air Force has not performed very well at all in this onslaught, and as well as their infantry has not done very well. And so in some ways, there's a sense that Putin is bluffing when he puts out these challenges. The heavier issue is one of airstrikes. And for the sake of being a devil's advocate, or maybe not a devil's advocate, but I think when you're looking at a genocidal momentum that's building in Ukraine, as it was built in Syria, the question is, what can stop a genocide? If Putin is serious in his declaration that he wants to destroy up to 20 million people, that's going to be every bit as horrific as the Holocaust was. And the sense is that the best time to stop a genocide is in the early stages, not when it's full blown, not when it's out of control and you're already all hell is broken loose in Ukraine. And just for the sake of discussion, I think it's valuable to consider the fact, as painful as it is, that when you're looking at the Bosnian genocide, which was smaller than the other genocides on some level, arguably what ultimately brought that to a close was that NATO and President Clinton finally said, I can't stand this carnage anymore. I can't stand the fact that there's direct artillery attacks on Sarajevo and the slaughter of the 8,000 Bosniak boys and men. And he called in the airstrikes, and in a hurry, the Serbs ended up at Dayton, and they were negotiating in a hurry to bring that thing to an end. Now,
right,
obviously,
that was with a minor power, Serbia. But
right. To be sure, Serbia does not have nuclear weapons. Yeah,
but that's what I was going to get to. Okay.
Right. Absolutely, and that is obviously we're in a much bigger calculated risk. But the sense is, does Putin want to be humiliated by a set of airstrikes that finally liberates the city like Kharkiv that has 2 million people in it? Or even if a lot of them have fled or become IDPs, you're still looking at about 1 million people that are still living in the underground right now there. So that's I think a lot of Ukrainians feel strongly that it's a risk, that definitely declaring a no-fly zone is an appropriate step to take, and to see whether that results in a pushback, and then to see where that ends up.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Who would like to ask a question of either speaker? Let's see. Let me put it back to gallery view. You could raise your hand. We don't have that many people. Or you could do a virtual raise hand. Luann, is your hand up?
Yes, it is, because I wanted to know what Nidal thought about the no-fly zone, if he has an opinion about it.
Oh yeah, of course. Like the no-fly zone was one of the first battles that Syrians had to fight in the United Nations, and with Obama's administration back then, and actually the Turks were pushing very hard to enforce a no-fly zone in Syria, and the United States refused back then, despite that they have in Syria until today actually a deconfliction hotline. So they were worried that they will hit a Russian fighter jet, and then a war will erupt. But guess what? the Turks back, I think it was in 2013 or 14, they downed a Russian MiG, and then nothing happened. Unfortunately, sometimes the good solutions and the right solutions come very late, and this is what I'm worried about in Ukraine. Although in Ukraine there is like a huge difference between the situation in Ukraine and Syria now, like a lot of weapons is going to Ukraine, and the Ukrainian army is solid and pushing back, and the resistance is very strong. And in this context, I just want to say something very quick. I don't know if there is a good war. Wars are bad, right? But in this situation, we have like a good gun and a bad gun, and this is the reality on the ground. And Ukraine today is the good gun that is defending not only Ukraine, it's defending the democracy around the world. It's defending Ukraine is defending human rights values. It's actually what happens in Ukraine in this war will define our world like for years and decades to come. And especially like the current international system, which will stand or will collapse. And Ukraine is going to tell us this soon, I think.
Okay, next question. Nina and then Terry. Let's go to Nina.
Okay, I have, well, two questions, but okay. Did Syrians want more or any U.S. help?
And what is your second question?
My second question is, what is there a diplomat? The peace people, the standard peace people, they all talk about a diplomatic solution based on basically, as I see it, on Ukraine giving up and saying, okay, take what you want. Is there a diplomatic solution?
Okay, those two questions. So Nidal, I think the first one would be to you. What did Syrians want from the U.S. or what did some Syrians?
No, actually, maybe part of Syrians, especially people like Syrians here in the U.S., they were pushing for U.S. intervention. But I want really to be very clear at this. Like the Syrian revolution was not erupted in 2011. The Syrian revolution started way earlier than that. It was started in 2000, and like people paid a high price earlier. In 2011 was the peak. And what happened that the U.S. ambassador in Damascus back then, Robert Ford, he visited one of the funerals, and people understood that the United States is standing behind the Syrian people. But unfortunately, that was not the situation. But in general, no, Syrians did not ask for like the U.S. intervention. Neither they asked for any intervention in the world, But I think what happened that the brutality of the Syrian regime, and then later the Iranian militias, and then later the Russian intervention in Syria, like you have the three armies occupy the country, and people cannot resist them by themselves. And this is how Syria turned from a peaceful revolution into a proxy war. But to answer the short answer for Nian's question, no. Syrians did not ask for any intervention from anyone from the day one.
And Alex, the question about those who say don't send Ukraine weapons, have more diplomacy.
I tend to think that there's no interest in diplomacy on Putin's side at this point. I mean, he's basically trying to see how much he can grind, down to rubble. I think that definitely the Ukrainians have been able to push back largely because they've been well armed by the West at this point. And I do think that because in a way, ironically, because Putin has such a stranglehold over the media and that he hasn't even admitted that there's a real war, he's only calling it a special military operation. That may be the exit strategy, that if Putin is that his people don't even know what's happening on the ground, other than maybe the families of soldiers, Russian soldiers that are getting killed out there. So I hate to think in these terms, but my hunch is that if there was, a resounding defeat of Putin's forces in eastern Ukraine, that would give him a fig leaf where he could basically say, okay, mission accomplished. I went out there to protect all those, Russian speaking people. We've liberated, that a slightly larger area. People won't even know how much they've quote unquote occupied or liberated anyway. But then he could withdraw the troops and basically declare victory, and leave bygones be bygones. And again, the sooner that happens, the less loss of life I think there would be. And that's what requires a really strong response from the West. I don't think the Ukrainians, Zelensky certainly has not asked for boots on the ground. I mean, that's clearly off the table. They're willing to fight their own fight. The international brigades that have come in including from Syria and Liberia and Nigeria and other countries, they're very grateful for that. But yeah, I think the piece that they're asking for is a level playing field with the no-fly zone, and to basically paralyze the Russians from using airstrikes to bombard cities. That's their bottom line.
I would add that this idea that don't send Ukraine weapons, that means you're asking for them to surrender.
Yeah.
And then, Russia would take over the whole country, and then there would be negotiations. I mean, that would be a joke. That would be nothing at all.
Yeah.
And I find it kind of infuriating to a lot of people have respected a heck of a lot in the past. They say you need negotiations, you need diplomacy. And then they come up with ideas for Ukraine. And it's all concessions from Ukraine.
Right.
Russia has done this aggression. And some of them will say, yeah, it was an aggression, horrible violation of international law. But Ukraine should do this. Ukraine should give up that. Noam Chomsky says, Crimea off the table,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's something for Ukrainians to decide, but he and what I wrote in an article about him, it was arrogant for him to just say that.
Crimean Tatars should have something to say about that too, I think, besides the Ukrainians. But yeah, no, I agree, Stanley. And, I mean, I hate to make this comparison, but, if you're looking at the Holocaust, right, you had hundreds of thousands of people getting slaughtered in Treblinka and Auschwitz and other areas. Would Hitler have stopped with a negotiated settlement? I don't think so. And now you've got a tyrant that is completely this mega murderer who's saying, I'm going to destroy this whole country. He's not gonna back down because of some negotiated settlement. I really don't think so. I think he's going to have to be humbled and unnerved enough that his army is not performing, and he's going to have a humiliating defeat, much as Stalin had a humiliating defeat in Finland in 1940. That's, and it was, but Stanley, that there too, there's a little bit of wiggle room that is not appetizing for Ukrainians, because the Finns, I didn't realize this, but Finland did give up territory to get Stalin out. And so I think, but for the people that have suffered these massive killings in Mariupol or in Kharkiv, they'll be damned if they're going to let, they want to get back into those cities to rebuild. And a lot of these refugees that are now in Poland and Slovakia, they want to go back. They don't want to live in Poland or the United States or Canada. They know what Ukraine was emerging into, which was a very promising democratic country with very viable economy, and a lot of pioneering technology changes and incredible agricultural output. This was not a wasteland, and that's the other whole issue that I didn't bring up earlier. But the other reason why the West probably needs to think hard about sooner than later intervention is that we're already suffering higher food prices because Ukraine's agricultural output has been severely degraded, and Russia's output has been severely degraded. If Ukraine cannot plant the crops that it generates every year. I mean, there are millions of tons of barley, wheat, soy, corn, maize that Ukraine exports to countries like Egypt, Yemen, Nigeria. You're looking at a secondary genocide, which is mass starvation. And that's something the world definitely cannot afford either. So it's a very challenging situation that the youth really needs to bring this war to a close, so that, frankly, the farmers can start planting, and so that we don't have this massive food shortage around the world.
Thank you. Terry, you were next with a question. If you could unmute.
Did Arwa want to make another comment in relation to what he said? No, another question. Okay, this is such a propaganda war, just like Syria. And those of us who are Syrian solidarity activists know the propagandists, and we're seeing them all push Russia's propaganda now on Ukraine. But I wanted to know a good source. Today on Facebook, there was a discussion about Gleb Lyashenko. He's a pro-Soviet blogger in Ukraine who was detained. I can see from several newspaper articles that he was detained, but the news today was supposedly that he got a 15-year sentence. Where can I go for accurate information on Ukraine to disprove something like this? Is Kiev independent, online or English?
Yeah, that's usually a good source. There's a terrific gal, I don't know if she's still there in Kharkiv, a woman named Helena, her name escapes me right now, but she's an incredible human rights activist who has been a real fair arbiter of human rights issues in Ukraine. And I apologize. I'll get you her name, or for Stanley, so he can pass that along.